Welcome to Brave. Be inspired by the best leaders of Southeast Asia tech. Build the future, learn from our past, and stay human in between. I'm Jeremy Au, a VC, founder, and father. Join us for transcripts, analysis, and community at www.jeremyau.com. Hi, Mark. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Hi, it's lovely to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, I think there's something that has to be said because you've really built a matter of expertise really on communications for startups in Southeast Asia, which is a rare thing because every startup, every founder is asking themselves, how do I get my message out? How do I show our mission, our team, our product, and how do I just get out there, right? And I'm so excited to not just hear your personal journey, but also your expertise on this domain.
Yeah, absolutely. Delighted to be able to kind of come on and share that.
Yeah, so for those who don't know you yet, tell us about yourself.
So as been said, my name's Mark, and I'm one of the co-founders of a company called Seed Strategies, and we work with startup and very early stage kind of scaling companies to help them, give them guidance on communications and kind of develop strategies, come up with tactical elements that can kind of, like you say, help get their word out there and kind of help kind of elevate and amplify their product and what they're doing to kind of the audience that they're kind of trying to target. Prior to that, I've worked in Asia since 2011, mostly in PR and comms. So that's taken me on a journey of China to Indonesia and then to the UAE. And if you go back even further, which is kind of getting quite far back these days, I used to work in political communications in Europe prior to coming across to Asia.
Awesome. And, I got to ask, so what brought you out to Asia?
Oh, do you want the the real answer?
Yeah, tell us the real answer.
Oh God, my wife's going to kill me. Basically, my girlfriend at the time was moving to China, and I chased her there.
And clearly, it wasn't your wife. So she's
Yeah,
now your
well,
wife.
she's now my wife. So clearly, I did the right thing.
Oh, that's fine then. You kind of implied that it was someone else. Why would she?
No.
Why would she do that? I was like, she would hate it because she was chasing someone else.
Yeah, no. Yeah, so that's
good that we clarified on the podcast to be like, the woman you chased to Asia is now your wife. Great.
Yes.
That's a love story.
Yeah, it is. So she'll probably cringe when she listens to this and goes, "Why did you have to tell that story?"
Well, it's a good story, right? Because what was it like chasing someone? Was she impressed? Was she not impressed? Was she confused by you doing it?
I think she was impressed and also scared at the same time. So, but I think, it worked out in the end. And China's such a vibrant place anyway that I think there's so much to do there that I think it kind of worked out. So, yeah. So, she's now my wife, so she couldn't have thought too badly of it.
Being impressed and fear is like the foundation of every good marriage, right?
Exactly. And startup. So, those two things are very, very similar.
I always tell people, the two things no one ever trained me on was like how to build a startup and how to build a marriage relationship, right? It was like, no one taught me any of this stuff. I learned a ton about organic chemistry and photosynthesis and, positive feedback cycles in a pond, and I learned nothing about being nice, having a good argument in a way that doesn't destroy the relationship, let alone, build a startup. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Those would be fundamental skills that I would add to a curriculum at school.
In the future. So communications. Okay, so you're in Asia, and then along the way, you also start to focus on communications as a career, right? Not just from a functional perspective, but also from an advisory and consulting basis. So tell us more about how you fell into the communications vertical.
I think it was just a natural progression. I think a lot of what I was doing in politics was kind of focused on getting the message out there, creating narratives. How do you win an election? You win an election by developing smart campaigns with a good story. So I think when I moved to China, I was like, well, I still want to kind of carry on in that kind of vein, but can I really focus in on that? And so that kind of led me into that kind of sphere and sort of seeing how vibrant and how interesting and how many tools were coming out at the time, especially over the last decade, made me think that this is a really exciting area to get into that is often overlooked. It's sort of like, I think we're going to dive probably into this a bit later, but like if you think about startups in Southeast Asia, it's like, I need this, and this. Do I really need comms right now? And so I find it very fascinating how essential it is, but how often you have to kind of teach and educate people why having a fantastic story is so essential to startup success.
Yeah. So there you're in Asia, you're in China specifically, and then I actually overlapped with you while we were there in Beijing, right? Because I was there for an exchange semester at Tsinghua, actually, and then doing an internship during the same time frame as well, actually. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what did you learn from your experience? Was it a big culture shock? Obviously doing 2 jumps, right, from the UK to Beijing, and then secondly, obviously, kind of moving from working in the politics arena to working on the communications angle. So it's like 2 transitions at the same time. What was that like?
It was difficult in so far as things you're very useful, structures or ways of thinking maybe about communication are slightly different. And there's definitely a kind of, especially at the time, a difference between kind of what I was learning in the UK and also kind of US way of kind of doing communications and kind of how maybe it's viewed over in China and Beijing. And just, I mean, it was just constantly changing, even from the period of time I was there, just the rapid change of China and also again the kind of how you do communications, what's available to you was changing so quickly. Whereas I almost look at sort of the UK and the US as being kind of very slow moving beasts. You know, they're obviously more developed, and that also means that some of the structures are a little bit hard to knock down. Whereas I think just the fast-paced nature and sort of almost the kind of sort of energy that kind of was there when it was kind of companies being created or people getting into PR and comms and having these new ideas. So that took some getting used to, and it's kind of actually remained a bit of a fixture ever since then, like just that kind of rapid changing landscape of communications and PR.
Was it tough transitioning? I mean, like I'm just because it feels like a big jump. I remember when I was spending time in China, and it was also a big, culture shock in some ways, right? Even though a lot of the Chinese people look at me and say, "Hey, you're not too far removed in terms of like blood, right?" From that perspective. Yeah. But having, kind of like growing up in Singapore and having studied in the States, it was kind of like a big, difference, right? So I'm just kind of curious how you felt that transition went for you.
I think I like the challenge. I think I was looking for a challenge. That's also one of the reasons why I moved. So I think in a way that challenge was very exciting. But I completely agree with you. Your transitioning career, and I'm sure a lot of people who have done startups and things like that have had this. You're transitioning career, but you're also transitioning life. And so you've got to work out those 2 very critical things at exactly the same time. So on the one hand, you can be in a meeting where, and especially at the time, like I had my Chinese Mandarin was terrible. And at the same time, you would then go home, you're like, how do I now pay my electric bill? Or I've got to go to a bank that's now closed. So I've got no electric tonight, like all of those things that you take for granted. Like, so there was definitely a learning curve. I was very lucky in terms of sort of the support network I had when I was in Beijing and the people I knew. But like, I think like with anyone, there's that kind of transition, especially the first few months where you're like, have I made a crazy mistake? Do I go back home where it makes a lot more sense? I've got a career that's very established. I've got friends that are established. Or do I kind of double down and say, actually, this is what I've chosen. This is exciting. This is something I really want to kind of continue with. So I think for me because that outweighed the kind of draw back home, I was never going to kind of turn back. And so even though it was difficult and there are a lot of things you had to deal with, I kind of never really felt like it wasn't what I kind of wanted to do. So.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that and being frank about that transition, because I totally agree. It's hard to focus at work or run and do a job interview if you're haven't figured out how to get electricity on. So, there you are. And then you make a decision to continue and double down on the communications career, which is what I find very interesting, right? Because you're doing a series of them and then you doubled down on them and you went off to the UAE to do a stint in that. And what was that like?
Oh, that was fascinating because we were working again, you suddenly have this kind of big change, a little bit more of a middle ground between sort of like the UK and kind of Asia. So you've got some kind of aspects that are sort of the fast moving pace in terms of different changes to the communication industry. But at the same time, there's also some very similar desires for clients and things like that that are very similar to clients from the UK. But I was very fortunate to be working on sort of sustainable energy and clean tech when I was out there. So that was the comms I was doing. So that was super fascinating because it was around sort of the big COP climate change agreement that they signed. So we were doing a lot of communications around there. We were lucky enough to do comms around Joe Biden coming to the UAE, which was fascinating. So, when you're working on, I think, what are hugely impactful spaces such as sustainability and clean tech, even though it's stressful and hard and you work long hours, you are also producing or helping to produce something that's very, very beneficial to society. And I think almost that was just something so fascinating that I'll probably never be able to replicate in the intensity again, because we were working with an organization called Masdar, which is the renewable energy arm of the UAE government. And so, you're charged with doing some really, really cool things. So it was stressful, but super exciting. So I was glad I made that choice, although when I first arrived there, the transition actually was kind of harder than China a little bit, because we made the choice very last minute. And so I had not really got my brain around it. And the actual work started almost the day we touched down. So like there was no transition whatsoever. It was like full on, really hard. So that was almost a little bit more difficult than the transition to China, which is kind of strange.
Yeah, and also you already got her, right? So when you went to China, you were like on the hunt. So that's a good mission to get you through the electricity setup and the interview. And then the other one is like, oh, I already got her, right?
Yeah, there's less pressure. There's less pressure on me now to kind of make that work. Now I'm in the Middle East.
Yeah. So yeah. So okay, so there you are, and you there, and then after that, you start coming into Southeast Asia from there, right? Because you joined INSEAD, you're being the head of customer experience. So what was that like, coming to Southeast Asia proper?
Well, so because I had a small stint in Indonesia doing communications, but that was kind of on and off, and then kind of moving to the UAE. So it was really interesting because there are obviously differences, and so kind of coming here where I felt like the startup scene was more vibrant, and especially because I was at INSEAD, which obviously has a lot of links to the startup scene. So it was really interesting because I went from a hugely corporate world, which with Masdar is like, it's a huge corporation, and then suddenly like I was in Southeast Asia where I felt there was almost this kind of spirit of kind of wanting to do your own thing that I found very exciting and very interesting. But that was also just very different, because then you're starting to think of comms in a very different way, almost like it's a sort of like rough young startup kind of way of doing things, rather than this kind of very structured, the approval levels are 20 stories high and all this kind of stuff. So that kind of transition on a life sense wasn't very hard, because Singapore, I think people have probably said this before many a times, is a very easy place to transition to in terms of life. And then it was just kind of seeing how all the things that I had learned in communications and PR, some of the kind of toolbox that I had kind of developed myself, how that's now applicable to a new region, and also kind of new view in terms of the size of the companies and the types of people that I'm kind of looking to work with. INSEAD's a great transition for that type of stuff anyway, because it's kind of a melting pot of lots of different nationalities and ideas and things like that. So that really helped that kind of transition across as well.
What was it like working at INSEAD? Because most people have that experience of being a student there, right? As an MBA and so forth. What was it like to be on the guts of it?
It's interesting because it's this fantastic organization that has to deal with these very, very, you're dealing with very smart people every single day. So your main customer, so my role as a customer experience, your main customer is incredibly smart and demanding, and they want to get as much out of the year at INSEAD as possible. So it's kind of very interesting because you're like, there's never a moment's rest, because they always kind of need more, want more, or kind of have higher expectations. And at the same time, you're in the education sort of industry, which is often a little bit slower than some other industries. So you've got these kind of two worlds kind of clashing together. But it's also, again, very interesting and very exciting, because you're also part of so many major discussions that are at the forefront of changing industries, and that's what's also very fascinating. So I was very lucky to be kind of prevalent to kind of a lot of very interesting things that were happening there and the discussions that were happening at the same time as being kept on my toes by customers that were very demanding.
So there you are, and you're sharing about how you're seeing all these people being very entrepreneurial. There's a spirit of ownership, and that's when you decide to build your own thing, right? So how did that shape up?
Yeah, I think it kind of been playing on my mind, I think, over many years that I'd been working in PR and comms across the world and even in Southeast Asia, a bit in Indonesia. And I was like, I definitely at some point want to be doing my own thing. Perhaps a bit of an ego thing, perhaps a bit of, we all kind of want to have something that we can kind of call our own. And also something that kind of was always resting on me was that I always felt sometimes some of the kind of agencies that I'd worked for, I was never completely happy with the culture that had been developed. And kind of, I was like, the only way you can really change that is obviously, rising to CEO of a big PR company, or kind of create your own thing and then create the culture that you want alongside your co-founder, that you expect and that you want your employees to kind of deal with. So there was those things that were always playing on my mind that were kind of like saying, Mark, at some point you need to do this, otherwise you're going to regret it. And then, I mean, obviously one of the benefits of being in Singapore is the landscape for, I think, setting up a business, but also the landscape for startups. So every day I was going into INSEAD, and across the road is Block 71. And Block 71 is just a kind of, melting pot of incubators, VCs, startups, and you're seeing that every day, and you're just like, again, gnawing at you saying, there are many signs here saying you should kind of do your own thing. So it kind of was always there, but honestly, I think because I was surrounded by entrepreneurs at INSEAD, and because I was surrounded by entrepreneurs at Block 71, and the kind of chatter coming from the government in Singapore about the startup industry, I think it was those things that were like, okay, if you're ever going to do this, you're going to do it now, because you're not going to do it if you move back to the UK or the US. That's definitely not going to happen. The landscape is a bit more difficult. I think it's not as kind of startup friendly in many ways unless you went to San Francisco. So yeah, I think all those things kind of came together and it kind of pushed me to kind of say, okay, I'm going to do what I've always been saying I'm going to do, is I'm going to do comms better. And now it's going to be on my head if this doesn't work.
So you decided to do comms for startups and you do it by starting up your own thing.
Yes.
Which is another double transition, right? Because, you got to build a company and you're also building out a new vertical of communications because, historically, like you said, communications is seen as like, crisis control, to reduce the damage. It's used to like do product launches and releases. So there's assumption there's a large budget that already exists at some level. And, for startups, they have small budget, tight resources, not a lot of time actually even. And also, frankly, not yet experienced in how to work with communications professionals. So, you chose the hardest vertical to go after, I guess, to build a new business in.
Yeah, I mean, there has to be said something for also stepping back and going, okay, you are diving into an area where you're going to have a lot longer conversations when it comes to budgets and things like this. And as you say, like a lot less experience. And also, you're a startup. So you're both the CEO, the CFO, you are also kind of doing marketing work. Like, you're fulfilling a lot of roles, especially at the start. But there's also a flip side that kind of still convinced me that this was worthwhile. With budgets and sort of payments and things like that, there's always a way to work things out in terms of, and so we're very flexible in terms of how we kind of do that. Sometimes it's very straight up kind of payments, and sometimes it's kind of like milestone based. So there's ways to work around that. But what convinced me to do it was actually how fresh a lot of the startups were to communications. And in many ways, that's kind of a beautiful thing because actually, again, like I said to you, the kind of structures you hit your head up against when you're working with big corporates. I mean, I've done work with, say, someone like Audi before, which I had a great time doing, but I don't think I'd necessarily be able to introduce too many innovations into their communications and push them in a direction like that I thought maybe was right, but they were not so sure of. That's a hard sell. Whereas I find that with startups, there's a lot of faith, because they've got to have faith in a lot of different things in order to kind of make it work. And so you kind of have this relationship where it's very much like a partnership rather than a kind of client consultancy. They need you as a partner, and that allows you to kind of really get in there, as long as that's where the relationship is. And kind of, I think, ensure that comms and their DNA flows through everything, rather than it just being hey, we're coming in to just do this little, like you say, product launch. And I think that for me was what convinced me that it was really worthwhile to kind of double down on this kind of, like you say, vertical, and kind of, although it's going to be difficult and there's a lot of educating to do, it's also in the long term really viable and worthwhile doing.
So, I've been a founder who's been on the other side of the table to communications professionals calmly explaining to me, A, B, and C. So for the benefit of obviously all the other founders, like, what's the benefits of bringing on a communications professional, right? Because, yes, I do need to do press releases. Yes, I need to articulate A and B and C. And yes, I post on social media and I'll get the message out. But why do I need a communications professional to help me with this fuzzy word called communications?
That's a very good question. Honestly, it's because communications is everything. So everything you do is about communication. So if you think about it there's a big thing about authenticity in today, where companies that are more authentic, they do better generally. And it's like, statistics show this. If you're not authentic and you haven't got your messaging right internally and all of this stuff, then the bigger you go, the faster you move, the more the wheels are going to come off. So the way I look at it is just like, think about every single day of what you do. Every part of that is communications. I mean, if you work with someone who understands that and can get that right at the start, that helps your growth. And it makes your growth so much easier. If you think about when you're going in front of an investor, rather than doing those last minute investor kind of touch-ups, why not have your DNA and messaging done much earlier so that it can be authentic with an investor, it can be authentic with your future potential staff, that when you even come to a crisis, you actually manage crises far better when you've allowed communications to flow through everything you do. And also it's storytelling. People are obsessed with storytelling. Your online footprint is storytelling. Every time you're in a room with people is storytelling. And again, if you get that right, that's a huge difference between success and failure. And so for me, the reason why it's so important is because you can't hide from communications, and it is so vital to everything you do that, again, if you have people there supporting you and kind of providing you that feedback and guidance, it can help you in so many different parts of your business. And I would say this, you'll be surprised by how often, so I often do this thing with founders where I get them by themselves and I ask them, tell me about your business. You'll be surprised by even companies that have raised a little bit, how different the versions of the company are. And that only becomes more tricky to handle and to work with the bigger you get. So I think it just kind of goes back to that's why, because I think comms, whatever you want to call it, because I think people call it different things, and PR and all this stuff, it's much more than a press release. Like, actually, if you want to get yourself some, noise, a press release is kind of the last thing you want to be doing, because that's you kind of trying to beg the media to kind of give you space. But actually, comms is about having a comms person help you develop relationship with journalists way before ahead of time, so that when you do come to wanting to make a big splash, you've already got those relationships. So it's all of those things. It's not just the kind of surface level. It's so much below that. And again, I go back to the word, it's your DNA of a company, and comms helps that flow through everything you do.
Yeah, that's all good and great, but I'm a founder that doesn't have much cash, right? So when should I bring in a communications professional? Because yeah, sure, if I'm a unicorn, I definitely will have communication professionals that I've hired myself. So somewhere along the way, I'm sure I need an agency, but when should I be thinking about bringing someone on professionally to support me?
I think there's an element that obviously when you're really, really early stage startup, and like we do this when we work with some of the incubators, You have some very early stage ones where you may be just providing them with kind of tools. So I do think there's a lot of stuff out there right now where if you're that early, you can kind of find online. There's a lot of more kind of people have digitalized lessons and things like that. And I would say that maybe like sometimes it is too early, but I think as soon as you start kind of thinking of when you've kind of started getting seed round and stuff like that, and things are starting to move because it moves quickly, that's when you actually should be thinking of it. And the reason why I say that is that there are a lot of very high quality there are different types of agencies out there that can actually really, really help. And so I do think there are options out there. I wouldn't always say that you have the big behemoths, and of course your budget's going to come nowhere near that. But I do think, again, if you understand and start looking very early on, you actually understand what type of agency is going to work for you, especially a fit as a partner, but a fit as a budget. And I think those two things you can actually kind of work out. I think what the problem is often people leave it and then suddenly have a product launch, or then suddenly have pitching to investors, or kind of whatever it is. And they're going for a new seed or a new round of raising, and they need to kind of get the word out there. And that's when it kind of doesn't work, because you've not done the due diligence beforehand. So I think for me, it's actually worth engaging quite early on, but not too early. And it's definitely worth your budget. And you actually can find a lot of, there are options out there where companies can be very flexible to actually match your needs. And that goes back to the partnership thing. Find someone who's going to be a partner, rather than sort of that kind of very dyed in the wool, very rigid kind of client agency relationship. Hey, you want a press release? Okay, we're going to charge you for free press releases. I don't think that type of thing works. So for me, actually, it's like anything in life. When you're having a service, have a conversation and find out actually what value they're going to bring to you. And I actually say this every time I do webinars and podcasts. If they sell you some very rigid structures, like, again, hey, we're just going to do this, this, and this. And if they give you a team that looks nothing like the team that's actually supporting you when they come for the pitch or they sit down with you, those are all kind of warning signs. So those are things that I've seen happen. And I think if you're just very smart about how you do it, a comms agency can be a very important partner for your growth.
So you talk about yellow flags, red flags, and you're also talking about how to distinguish between, better agencies versus worse agencies. So how do I, as a founder, obviously start saying to myself, okay, I've raised my seed round, I'm going to raise my Series A in a year and a half. I got to build this product, etc. I have a small budget. I'm going to deploy some of it on marketing and maybe a little bit in communication. So I have a small budget here. I'm starting to think about it. And I start asking my friends for recommendations, right? So I was like, hey, buddy, who do you recommend for comms or anything, or who can help out? And some people throw out some names, and I have a list of 10 to 20 names, right? So how would I, as a founder, tell the difference between a good salesman versus a good agency that's going to deliver good results?
I think you do two things. One, I think information is everywhere now. Literally, as a company, it's almost like I do this crisis comms workshop because I'm like, every day can be a crisis, or every day can be an issue, because information's out there. So even with kind of agencies, you can actually do a little bit of digging and find out who their client base is. Well, most of them have them on their website, and just have a look at some of the campaigns and some of the work they've done for them. You can actually find that stuff quite easily. It's like anything, you don't buy a car blindly. You kind of do a bit of research, even for the place you're going to buy it from. And I think the same sort of thing kind of applies. I think you can actually look around. I'm not going to name any of our competitors right now, but you can actually see, I think within an hour, be able to kind of point you in the direction of, these are clearly signs of kind of a good company who understands startups, understands their journey and kind of what they need. And these are ones that say they do it, but they don't really do it. It's just, it's maybe if they can get a client or not. And then I think also, I always think you're in the position of power. Basically, agencies want to work with you, and therefore utilize that. Have them come and sit down with you, but don't do it in a formal way so it's called an RFP, where you go and pitch and blah, 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 blah. I don't think you find out much from that type of thing, but actually see how they are. If they kind of want to have a coffee chat, kind of do a bit of testing and see, even if you ask a very basic question, we've got this coming up. Any quick suggestions? Obviously, we're having a conversation maybe about budgets as well. You can utilize your position of power to kind of find out more information and find out how willing they are to kind of engage with you, be your partner, and all these different things. And I also just think when the startup world is super small, so if a few of your friends are saying they are fantastic, you're honestly going to probably find out that they are fantastic. So I think if you do those things, you're going to be able to find clearly the better ones within the space than other ones. And also it depends on your industry. Like some are far better at, I don't know if you're doing kind of fast moving consumer goods. There are ones that are better than other ones. And, it kind of, you've got to see what works for you in that sense.
So what I'm hearing from you is step one, have a real conversation with them and hang out with them. And two, see if they really get startups.
Yeah.
And then thirdly, of course, is hopefully they have a body of work that's relevant to the vertical that you're in as well. How do you know if an agency gets startups, right? Because it's like, they all walk in and they're all like, okay, these are the 5 unicorns in your space and they all have this brand image and this is how we're going to communicate. So it kind of looks like they get startups, right? It's hard to tell who gets it versus doesn't get it. I think from my past experience, I think vertical experience is the most obvious because, they will literally they'll walk in the bake off or the pitch moment and tell you all about the 5 companies they've already done in, healthcare or whatever it is, right? To show off the industry vertical experience. But I think the startup being able to know and appreciate who a founder is and the direction, that's a very tough thing to see or measure or compare. So I'm just kind of curious how you think about it.
I think you can come into a meeting, and again, I've seen it. I've been part of big pitches where you've walked in, you've got the lingo down and all this kind of stuff. But this is why I say also be careful not to, you can deformalize things. So by having a coffee, by having a chat, I think if you feel like they understand what you're going through, as well as, you pull it next to all of these other things, which is your body of work and all this stuff. I think what I mean by kind of understanding startups, it's not just, we understand getting you to a unicorn status because that's what we did last week for so-and-so, but also we understand what you're going to be going through from a budget position, from a staffing position. We understand the pressures or the difficulties you may have. And we're here, again, as a partner to kind of understand those and help you deliver first-class communications with a knowledge of those types of things. And I think for me, that's not just kind of reeling off kind of words that all startups understand and kind of show you kind of understand it a little bit. It actually shows that you kind of know what they're going to be going through a little bit more fundamental, which again, I think is super important because if you don't understand what the startup's going to go through on a day-to-day level and all of these things, how can you understand how they're going to deliver first-class comms? Because if they're being pulled over here, you've got to understand that and work around that kind of particular thing in order to deliver for them. So I think it's kind of, there's an authenticity that kind of works back the other way that I think if you just kind of have a bit more time with them and get that partnership right, I think that's very, very important. And I think one of the reasons I go back to what I said earlier is that the problem is obviously it's left quite late to the point where you really need an agency. And then you don't have time to kind of get to know whether they're the right fit for you. And then you go with the ones that kind of have the biggest numbers. And that's obviously the danger, and it's not always easy to kind of get right. But again, I think when you spend your time with them and kind of really get to understand whether they kind of understand what you're going through, I think that's a vitally important aspect of that partnership.
Now, I really like what you said, right? Which is, I think at the end of the day, when you deformalize the thing, it can let you move away from the glossiness of it and kind of really kind of probe the real human side of it, which I really like, which is do they understand not just obviously your vertical, but also the fact that you are a startup in terms of the company stage, in terms of way of work. But lastly, I think the smart thing you're also saying is also really kind of understanding the company itself, right? The client / direction. And the fact is that for many startups, it's still being, formed in motion. It's still a work in progress at best.
And I think that's an important thing to reiterate is that sort of look for an agency that feels like they're flexible, almost like they've got a little bit of the startup attitude with you. And I think there are some fantastic ones sort of out there because, they kind of need to be a bit flexible. This is, again, we're not working with a corporate where you can say, we've got this budget and we've got this milestone and let's get some media attention and let's do X, Y, and Z. Like, things shift like all the time with startups, and you've kind of got to have a team and have an agency and have a partnership that kind of can kind of shift with that a little bit. That's the reality. Like, if they don't really want to, if an agency can't work with that kind of world, then they should really focus on not startups. It should be, much later, because it's a lot easier. It's a lot more structured. It makes a lot more sense. So I think they've almost got to have a feeling, like you have a feeling, that they have this kind of ability to adapt and be flexible, because that's the only way you can make it, I think, a successful sort of partnership and kind of help a startup in the long run.
Right. And so let's just say that you manage to pick someone who's not terrible, hopefully above average to good, how should a founder be thinking about what they need to do to maximize the chances of this being a successful engagement and relationship?
I think only engage with an agency, really, if you're going to be able to find in some capacity the time to be able to do that. Now, again, there's a reality of time and jobs that everyone's doing in a startup, and each startup's different, in terms of how they structure themselves. But honestly, the thing that one of the struggles that we have, or what you have in the industry, is because comms often is thought of as a secondary nice to have. That means when you come to engaging with an agency, it still remains a little bit of a secondary nice to have. And therefore, there's not enough time commitment to at least kind of get it to where it needs to be. Now, for me, there's a reality there. You're not always going to have access to the people all the time and things like that. But I think if you're going to engage with an agency, one of the most important things to making it a success is at the start, at the very least, when you're mapping out that strategy, when you're really diving into the DNA of the company and the why you're doing, because that's what you've mostly got. Like, you may have a good product, but that takes a while to sort of kind of build and kind of tell that story. But like, if you kind of spend the time and double down on that at the start, then that helps the agency as well as they move forward, understand who you are and get right all of that authenticity stuff. And then maybe there's more time where you can kind of leave them to almost be like your in-house kind of comms kind of department. So I think for me is, if just only do it if you're serious about kind of the commitment. And again, because I'm talking about comms being embedded really deeply in kind of what your company does. If you want just a company to pump out a press release, then of course you can engage them at any time, and they probably have some connections and probably be able to have it somewhere else placed. So, that's also a different consideration, I suppose.
And that seems to imply that at a minimum, you need to front load a lot of time, right, to ramp up the agency, to understand the why, the story, the narrative. So that makes a lot of sense. Any other tips you have for a founder to be able to maximize the value from working with a communications agency, a partner?
I think if you get it right, kind of trust them a little bit, I would say. So again, if you front load it a little bit, I think after that, you've then got to kind of put faith in sort of what they're suggesting. They are meant to be your advisors. So they're not meant to be just, they can get the work done that we can't do, and we can get it done for a little bit cheaper than, say, maybe having 2 staff fully employed. That's probably the wrong way to look at an agency. So have faith in the fact that these are professionals, and they may come to you with some great ideas that can really help kind of elevate your communication, elevate your brand, elevate your positioning. So I think also utilize them, and I know this sounds weird, but like, I've actually had sort of where we've had clients where I don't feel like they utilized us fully. And so I'm like, you're paying for not, I think, really kind of testing the agency. And like, I think if you're paying money, especially as a startup, you should also have expectations that they can come to you with ideas. And that's one of the big things. A friend of mine who's got a startup, she was saying she always just sometimes feels like with agencies, they don't come to you just out of the blue with just continuous ideation. And I think maybe that's what you should set the challenge to your agency, is that you expect them to kind of ideate and come with new ideas as part of your relationship. And so again, I think just don't just allow them to run comms. Do expect stuff from them, but also listen to them when they're bringing ideas. And I think if you can kind of do that, then you're going to get a lot out of your agency, and they're not just going to be kind of ticking over, just doing kind of like the tick box stuff. They're going to do much more for you.
Yeah, I think it's amazing because you're really kind of like talking about, having the relationship move away from just being transactional to being a true partnership. And I think that differentiates, I would say, the good from the great agencies, right? Because I think the good agencies are transactional and get it done, right? I think average is, transactional and they sometimes get it done.
Yeah, and there's plenty of agencies out there that fill all of those. But I think you hit a nail on the head, 100%. That the transactional, and again, that can work for some companies. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it doesn't, but like you say, the two really great ones are the ones that kind of go beyond that, and it is a partnership and kind of understand your growth and what you're trying to do next and what you need to be able to kind of get there. And I think that you can get that. So yeah, that's absolutely right how you kind of positioned it.
So, I think the tricky part is that, for everybody, it's just kind of like, okay, if I hire one more engineer, I get to supposedly deliver my product earlier and get this feature, will get paying customers, right? And if I hire one more sales rep, they're supposed to bring in this amount of money to the door, right? And then I look at my comms budget and I'm like, whoa, like what I get again? Like I got some press releases, I got some comms training, we got a few conversations, but it feels like a bit squishy, right? Because those articles, I'm not sure how to translate to the business. Comms training, was nice to have. So how do we define success, I guess, on a mutual, win-win, straightforward basis?
I mean, I think there is something there. I think that there is some intangibles to communications. I mean, if I sell you my phone, there's a transaction there and I get money and you get a phone, and it's very straightforward. Whereas obviously, when you're talking about sort of communications, it sometimes feels like intangible. But I do think often that's because it's just a set of deliverables that are, hey, get us a press release and get us here. Actually, your job is, again, like I said previously, to demand more, and that's why you front load everything by sitting down and making sure everything's attached to KPIs. So, okay, comms may only do 70% of the job of delivering on that KPI, but there is an expectation it does. And so I'll give you an example. When you're working in politics, like the end goal is for me to win an election. Now, there are many strands to winning that election, but comps is a fundamental part of that. And so I do think you can set some very clear KPIs with, and it's actually one of the failings of both agencies and startups or companies in general, is not setting very clear KPIs with an understanding that comms will not magically do everything, but it should play a fundamental part to that. And I think if you're clear about those at the start, then I think that wishy-washiness a little bit later, you're able to kind of navigate beyond that. Because I do think, and it's about, again, I think it goes back to the partnership stuff, because I think if you've not developed that kind of relationship, I'm sure plenty of agencies don't necessarily really want to have very clear KPIs, because then if you don't have clear KPIs, you're not really held negatively against them, and and all this stuff. But I think if you actually choose the right agency, and also you're very serious about putting in the effort to kind of have comms, then I think you can sell it against KPIs that actually do make sense to you. And also I think it's about having an open and honest relationship. I think, again, I go back to, I think you should always be able to speak to an agency and say, is this of value to me? Like, if I get in, I don't know, tech in Asia, is that actually going to do anything for me? Or what is it you're giving me? Which is why I always say this is more than just PR. It's about comms, because there are many different parts of the function of comms that actually bring value to you. So I think, again, it's about being clear and open and honest about what actually your needs are and what's actually of value to your company. And I think, again, a good agency who wants to really be your partner and go beyond transactional are the ones that also are saying that our success is this, this, and this. And it's not just getting you a nice, founder kind of picture in, I don't know, tech in Asia with a good article. And I'm not saying that's actually not useful. I'm just saying, that's not the be all and end all of everything to do with communications.
Yeah, definitely true. I mean, I think everybody wants to be on Tech in Asia and TechCrunch. And I often share and say, like, that's great, especially if you're looking at two VCs and fundraising. But is it where your customer is, right? If your customer is in, automobile shops, they're probably not reading TechCrunch, or Tech in Asia, they're probably reading something else. And so I think some of that communication strategy and clarity is, important.
One thing I would say, sorry, I think it's something I haven't said yet, but the most key, honestly, the key thing is that often gets forgotten: who is your audience? And I really do mean this, is that I often are surprised by how little thought sometimes goes into thinking about who is this for. And you're absolutely right. And I think if you double down on kind of really trying to understand your audience and why you're doing what you're doing, and to who you're trying to speak to and where do they live, that will save you a whole manner of time of wasting on things that are just, because it's also time consuming, writing an article and having your input and then pitching, blah, blah, blah. And if it's of little value and it's not speaking to the audience, then why are you even bothering to do it? And so I think, again, that goes back to doing a lot of the work at the start. It's like identifying and understanding and mapping the audiences and matching your communications and your narrative and storytelling to them. And that's literally probably the most fundamental thing that kind of often gets done wrong. That is so essential to, I think, success in this case.
Well, something to wrap things up here. Obviously you've gone through a lot of transitions, both in geography as well as in career, to basically master communications here. I'm just kind of curious, have there been any tough times or adversity where you've had to be brave?
I mean, I think brave is a very subjective word, because I think kind of there's so many things that people are brave about every single day, even at work, like talking out when you're scared of your boss. And I've seen that still happen many a times, and, getting up in front of people, to starting off podcasts and things like that. I think for me, it's a kind of the resilience that comes with having to do this, especially during COVID, where you have a massive peak with healthcare clients to a trough when everyone's like, okay, this is not going to go away. Let's tighten our budgets. And I think there's an element of, when we're all kind of not egotistical, but we all have our sort of ego. We all have you want to be proud of yourself. And I think it takes a lot to actually just keep on pushing and still be driven that what you're doing is right and what you want to do, and this is what you want to deliver on. And I think it kind of feels more brave for me that I'm still doing this, even through the peaks and troughs, versus probably just going back into corporate and nice monthly wage that is very, very nice, and you've got the contract and all these kind of things. And so for me, I've been surprised, because I've been in politics, I've been in corporate, and so I think for me, I feel like it's kind of been brave with the support of people, to kind of just keep on doing it through those peaks and troughs, and have faith that, and with hard work, it's kind of going to be good in the long term. So yeah, I think that's probably where I'd feel most brave.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate, I think, the three big themes that really jumped out at me. I think the first, of course, was your personal journey across countries in pursuit of love, but also in pursuit of, what you really are passionate about, right? Which is about the storytelling and communication side. And it's just been amazing to see that as someone who's listening to your story for the first time. And I think the second thing, of course, I really appreciated was obviously your domain mastery around how to pick the right communications partner, for better, for worse,
Yeah.
I'm sure that, but, I think it's very thoughtful, because I think most founders are very much in that position of having to pick their first agency. And I think you gave them some very good tips around how to look past the glossiness and really get to the heart of it, about whether they actually do understand not just the vertical and not just communications, but also understand the founder and the startup fundamentally, right, for where they are today and where they need to go. And lastly, of course, I really appreciated you sharing, of course, and multiple times of the episode, really your journey at being a founder yourself, right, of setting up a business that you want to do, both through the good times and the bad, and still keeping going. So I think that's really amazing, because, well, at minimum, you understand what a founder is going through. So thank you so much, Mark.
No, thank you. And I really appreciate the time on this, and doing a startup and things like that. You really get to understand the kind of grind, but also the good stuff. And so I think it's always really, really nice to share. And I think, again, the more people that can hear about communications, especially like looking through all the kind of think the subject matters on your podcast of the previous episodes. There's so much kind of information there, and obviously comms, is not always the first thing that kind of people get to hear about. So it's great to have an opportunity just to talk about kind of why it's so important, and also how to pick an agency. And I will say this, there are some really, irrespective of the one I set up, there are actually some fantastic agencies out there who really do get startups, but just take your time and kind of look for the right one. That's probably the most important thing.
Or you can reach out to Mark on LinkedIn or email for his list, and then you talk to him and you compare him against the people he recommends, right? So
100%.
All right, so don't forget to visit his website. What's your domain name?
seed-strategies.com.
Awesome. Well, if you like that, make sure you go to the site and check him out. And if you like the show, feel free to like and follow. And feel free, we will be having a discussion thread about this episode on club.jeremyau.com. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Brave. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share this episode with friends and colleagues. Sign up at www.jeremyau.com to discuss this episode with other community members in our forum. Stay well and stay brave.